So we've got the ability to get a list of activities back. Now let's look at getting a single activity from our database. So I'm just going to head back into VS Code, and inside Solution Explorer, I'm just going to clean up my open tabs. Inside the Application Activities folder, I'm just going to create another new class, and I'm just going to call this one Details. And what we want to do here is a similar thing to what we did earlier. So we're going to create a new class for our query, and it's going to be of type iRequest. And we'll need to bring in mediator. And what we're returning from this is just a single activity. So I'll just bring in domain for activity. Now inside this one, we will need to give this a property because we want to specify the ID of the activity that we want to get back. So I'm going to give it a prop, and our IDs are GUID, so I need to specify GUID here and also bring in system. And our query needs a handler. So below the class of query, I'm going to say public class handler, and this is going to be an iRequest handler. And once again, we'll pass in the query type and the activity, which is what we're going to be returning. And then we'll just need to implement this interface just as we did before. Now we'll also need access to our context again, so I'm just going to generate a new constructor, and I'm going to specify the data context and context as the parameter, and then I'll put my cursor in data context and say using persistence, and then I'm going to initialize field from parameter and remove this dot as per normal. Now in this particular instance, what we want to do is say var activity equals, and I'll need to make this an async method, so I'll add async operator here, and I'll say var activity equals await context.activities, and we'll use find async because the ID is the primary key that we're going to use to find our activity, and for the parameter here we'll have access to our ID via the request object, so I can say request.id. And then all I need to do is just return the activity. And this is our handler for our details request. Pretty simple. And what I need to do then is create the new method inside our API controller to call this particular handler. So I'm going to go into the activities controller. And below our list, I'm just going to create another new endpoint. And this is going to be an HTTP GET as well because we're getting our activity, and this time we'll need to pass in the ID as a root parameter of the activity that we're getting back here. And then I'll say public async task, and once again we'll return an action result, and we'll specify it's going to be an activity that we're returning here. And this time I'll just call this particular method details. And inside this one, what I'll do is I'll say return await mediator.send, and this time it's going to be a new details.query, and this time we also need to pass in the ID that we're getting from our root parameter. So we'll need to pass it into our details method here. So I'll specify GUID of ID and bring in system for our GUID. And then what we can do is we can initialize our new details query class with the ID by using curly braces and say ID equals ID. So when we create this query class, it's also going to have access to the ID from the root parameter that we get when we hit this particular method. So with this in place, we can go back to Postman and we can test that we can get an individual activity. So I'm just going to copy the GUID of the first activity in here, which is going to be past activity 1, and go to the get activity request, and I'll just need to update the root or the URL here and paste in the GUID of the activity I'm looking for, and I'm going to click send, and we get back the individual activity that matches that particular ID. Now we're still not doing any proper error handling, and if I change this to a different GUID and I click send, then I get a strange response. I just get a 204 no content. And the reason I'm getting this is because when I try and find an activity that doesn't exist, then the find async method is going to return null. And that's what we're returning back when we request an activity that doesn't exist. If I try and make a request to something that isn't actually a GUID and I actually take out that particular final character and then I click send, then I get a bad request. Now, we've not talked about validation yet. And the fact we're getting a 400 bad request back here when we haven't implemented validation may be a little bit confusing. But the reason we're seeing this is purely down to this API controller attribute that we added earlier on. Now, I'm not going to go into details about this now because it's much more appropriate to talk about this when we're talking about validation itself. But I do want to point out that the reason we're getting a 400 bad request at this particular stage is that our API controller is doing a little bit of magic behind the scenes. And like I say, I'm not going to go into detail about this now because we will talk about it later. But just in case you get tempted to test different things about what's going on at this early stage of our application, then you may come across this. But if I put this back in as it was before, then we still get our activity back from here as well. So that's our details handler. And what I want to talk about next is something that I've kind of been ignoring up to now. And that's these cancellation tokens. What are they? How can we use them? Should we be using them? And what benefits do they give us? And we'll talk about that next.